palaces, the most spectacular and lavish homes on earth. Luxuriously designed for the royals who wanted the biggest and the best. Behind the golden gates of these royal megastructures are incredible stories waiting to be discovered. Infamous monarchs from history, and the artists, designers, and engineers who turned their grand visions into a reality. These are the most opulent, flamboyant, and innovative royal residences around the world. This time, Lakshmi Vilas Palace is the largest private dwelling in India. The Indo-Saracenic designed residence was built for the Maharaja of Baroda in 1890 and remains the home of the royal family to this day. Hidden away in this magnificent structure are groundbreaking technical innovations that make Lakshmi Vilas one of the world's greatest palaces. Located in Vadodara in the western state of Gujarat, India, Lakshmi Vilas is almost 4 times the size of Buckingham Palace, despite the fact it was only built to house a small family. The palace fuses Hindu, Islamic, and British design styles to create a truly breathtaking building. The current Maharaja of Baroda is Samajit Singh Gaikwad, who lives at Lakshmi Vilas with his wife, the Maharani Radhika Raje, and their 2 daughters, Princesses Narayani Raje and Padmaja Raje. Maharaja Samajit Singh grew up at Lakshmi Vilas, which is now part family home and part tourist attraction.
We used to get a lot of people coming in and requesting that they wanted to see the palace. It was my decision in about 95, 96 that I said that we must open the palace up. There are people who actually want to come and see and admire this place. And ever since that, the number of visitors have just increased year on year.
The man who commissioned the 19th century palace was Samajit Singh's great-great-grandfather, the Maharaja Sayaji Rao III.
So we are at this place where the first stone for this magnificent palace was laid. And this was when Sayaji Rao himself was about 17 years old. He was born in 1863 and this stone was laid in 1880. And obviously Sayaji Rao was very young and he had a lot of people advising him when this palace was built. I can imagine they must have conceived and sort of visualized something quite magnificent at that point in time to create this great palace.
I think this was the first porch built, as the foundation stone and the completion stone are both attached to this porch. What we have here is the lion tending to a hare, which symbolizes in our culture the royalty. The lion would be the king, the emperor, and the hare would be the people, the subjects. So he protects them, takes care of them. I think it's a very, very ornate and beautiful porch as an entrance.
As well as being aesthetically pleasing, Lakshmi Vilas was at the forefront of technical innovation in 19th century British-ruled India.
The engineering itself must have been very challenging because every time now we take up jobs to repair and we realize how slow things move and how carefully we've got to do things. So it's just incredible that they could actually put this whole thing together.
Included in the design of the palace was a high-tech innovation that was being developed by American inventor Thomas Edison, 8,500 miles away in New Jersey: electricity.
Edison's company that he set up to try and bring electrification to the cities was set up in about 1882, and at that point there were just a few parts of Manhattan that were being electrified. So the fact that this palace had electrification was really modern, really quite unusual, and would have been quite ahead of its time.
At this time, there was no mains electricity available, so like those other buildings in this period that had electricity, the palace had to have its own generator. Electricity that could then be used for driving all sorts of things, but would have mostly been used for lighting as a safer alternative and a slightly brighter alternative to gas.
The electricity also powered the Maharaja's elevators, an extravagant luxury considering the palace is only 3 stories tall.
By the 1890s, elevator technology was fairly well established, and they were used to create high-rise buildings in America, but they were virtually unknown in private residences, and Lakshmi Vilas Palace is one of the first residential buildings in the world to have an elevator.
This is an elevator which was way ahead in time. The elevators are installed over here in the property palace, and it had a wooden cabins. If you see the wooden cabins over here, it had got a very nice veneer and a wooden walls, which was been ventilated with ornate grills, and it was been operated with an electric power at that time, which was very unique in those days.
Elevators were actually something that had been in existence for thousands of years. So when you go back to the Roman civilization, for example, they were using lifting platforms which they manually just pulled ropes around pulleys to bring their gladiators from, for example, the basement of the Colosseum up into the fighting arena. The problem with these sorts of lifting platforms was that if the rope snapped, then the platform would just plummet and usually kill the occupants. You know, I'm guessing that's not something they would have wanted in this very opulent 19th century palace.
Elevator technology had moved on thanks to an invention by American industrialist Elisha Otis.
Elisha Otis was a bit of a mechanical tinkerer type person who was working in a factory in New York around the mid-1800s. And he invented a type of braking system which depended on a special type of spring called the wagon spring, so that if the ropes did snap, the spring would kind of kick into gear and latch itself into toothed or ratcheted rails, and basically created a braking system that would stop the lift from plummeting. And he installed these first lifts in the 1860s and 70s in buildings in Manhattan, and so they were becoming all the rage in the late 19th century.
When it came to the Maharaja Sayajirao choosing an architect for Lakshmi Vilas, he had 2 people in mind: British architects Major Charles Mant and Robert Fellows Chisholm.
Chisholm had done a lot of projects in Baroda. Mant had hardly done any projects in Baroda. So the obvious choice was Chisholm to begin the project, but Mant was chosen. What little I know about Sayajirao Maharaj, he would have had a say.
At the time, India was still under British rule, but Mant was a chief proponent in a new design style that encapsulated both Western and Eastern cultures: Indo-Saracenic.
The architectural style is really a hybrid. There's arches, there's domes, there's minarets. It's incredibly ornate. It's almost fantastical. It is all types of palaces blended into one.
The idea was to combine the 2 traditional parts of Indian architecture, the Hindu and the Muslim architecture in India, the Mughal architecture, with a European style, which at the time was considered relatively forward-thinking and modern. Nobody was quite certain in this period what the correct appearance for architecture should be, let alone the correct appearance for imperial India. And the Indo-Saracenic architecture was an attempt to create a style that was appropriate for this new environment.
Construction of the gigantic 500-foot wide palace began in 1878.
No expense was spared on its construction. The best materials were sought from throughout the world and brought to the site. Everything had to be brought by ship, and thus took months to arrive, which meant that everything had to be planned even more carefully than a normal building project.
And I always wonder, how did they get the logistics in place? And back then, with the kind of roads, the transport, I can't still figure out how they managed it. So the whole story of this palace being built, conceptualized, put together, to me is still a mystery in a sense.
But in 1881, tragedy befell the British architect who had overseen the initial construction and design of Lakshmi Vilas.
Major Charles Mant was a massive perfectionist. He was obsessed. And as the palace progressed, he became very concerned that he got his calculations wrong and the palace would fall.
It is widely believed that Major Charles Mant became so consumed with fear that he took his own life, leaving the Maharaja's dream in tatters. After a year of construction, Lakshmi Vilas Palace remained incomplete. But in 1881, a new architect was hired to finish the grand structure.
Robert Fellows Chisholm was an engineer by training. This was actually normal in India at the time, where most architects had actually first trained as engineers and were qualified in both.
He took over and he said to not have made many changes apart from he introduced iron. Chisholm got in the iron. Before that, the details were all with wood. Wooden beams, wooden joists, everything. And Chisholm convinced the state that iron would be better structurally. In terms of everything. Naturally, right? Strength, maintenance, everything.
12 years after the foundation stone was laid, the Maharaja's new palace was complete.
This palace was built and finished by 1890, and this palace is spreaded in almost 500 acres. It's built by a Dangadra stone, which is a sandstone, which is a breathable stone. It's made with an Agra red and a blue trap from Pune, which is in Maharashtra, western side of part of India. Blue trap is considered very strong. It has got a beautiful density, maximum density among all stones which are used over here. So they are used in the plinth level and for the foundations over here.
The palace included a clever design trait, a late 19th century version of air conditioning, which was very much needed in the searing heat of an Indian summer.
These pipes, if you see, there are the pipes which were used to cool the fenestration part, and they were been sprinkled by water so that the hot air which passes through would be a little cold and would enter into the palace. So it was basically a local mechanism of a desert coolers. This palace was groundbreaking of the time when it was been built.
The intelligent engineering continues inside the palace. The largest room at Lakshmi Vilas is the Durbar Hall. Located on the ground floor, but rising 3 stories high, it covers 5,000 square feet, a little larger than a basketball court.
It's a magnificent hall. I think it's the most magnificent hall in the palace, but I think one of the most magnificent in India, if not in the world, because of how beautifully different styles and cultures are merged into this. There's Venetian, there's English, the chandeliers are English, the stained glass is Belgian, the motifs are Indian. So they're angels, as you can see, but they're wearing 9-yard saris, so they're completely Indianized angels.
The ornate balconies in the Durbar Hall are made from both sandalwood and rosewood, creating a two-tone aesthetic.
There's just so many elements if you look, and each one, if you break it down to really looking at each piece, there's so much detailing in it, and so much detailing it makes it Indian, which makes it unique, which makes it completely relevant to the hall that it is in. But when you look at it collectively, it's just so overwhelmingly beautiful.
The original architect of the palace, Major Charles Mant, had designed the hall with a sloping roof. but his successor, Robert Fellows Chisholm, reworked the plan before the Durbar Hall was completed.
For me, as an architect, see what is interesting about it is the fact that it's a flat roof, and such a huge flat roof, and for which they had to have the roof structure. The roof structure is almost 8-9 feet. You needed that depth of beam to span that larger structure. If you go above the false ceiling, there's almost 8 feet of the structure actually spanning this large big room.
There are primarily girders and the secondary girders also, which take the load of a flat roof. Those girders transfer the load to adjacent walls, which is 54 feet apart, and the length of the Darbar Hall is 98 feet, which was one of the biggest Darbar Hall in the western and the central part of India at that time, during that time. Now if you see the load of the structure, the slab flat roof structure has been transferred to walls. It has been transferred from the core building arches. These arches are core building arches, which is then again transferred to a column pillars, which are ornate pillars, and then to a foundation.
The symbolism in the Durbar Hall tells the story of how the Gaikwad dynasty came to rule over the former Indian state of Baroda.
So that is the family monogram, the coat of arms. You see a rider in the center of it on a horse, and the motto says, Jeen Ghar Jeen Takht, which is the saddle is my home, the saddle is my throne, indicating that the Maharaja and the royal family are always ready, prepared to protect the people. And it all begins with being on the saddle as a warrior.
So the Gaikwad dynasty came to be established in about 1730s by Damaji Rao Gaikwad. And it happened that the Gaikwads were part of the generals in the Peshwa's army. The Peshwas were based in Pune. The Marathas and the Peshwas had this great ambition of conquering and advancing their territories. And they came to Gujarat. And what happened was, once the Peshwa died, all the generals then, wherever they were at that point in time, became rulers of those areas, and they created their dynasties there. And that's how the Gaikwads also in this region started their kingdom.
By 1870, the Gaikwad dynasty was in trouble. The Maharaja Khandarao had died without a son, and his unpopular brother, Malharao, took the throne. Within 4 years, Malharao had been deposed after ruling as a tyrant and spending the family fortune. In 1875, Maharaja Khandarao's widow, Jamnabai, went looking for a potential ruler from outside the royal bloodline. She found the future Maharaja, Sayajirao III.
His is an incredible story. 3 boys came here with their parents, and each of them was asked a question. And Sayaji Rao, when asked a question as to why was he brought to Baroda, his answer was that he was brought here to rule Baroda, to become a king and rule Baroda. And that's how the story goes. And he was the one who was selected, picked up, and adopted at the age of 13. He was put under a very testing regime in terms of he had to learn English, he had to learn Gujarati, which was the language here. He had to learn so many other things in terms of the etiquette and whatnot. And he had to learn that in a very short span of time and adapt out here. And he achieved so many things in his life. And that's the reason why the city, the state, and people look up to him as a legend.
It's incredible to think that the Maharaja was picked as a young boy and groomed for success and became such a marvellous Maharaja, so far-reaching in his reforms. He was progressive, intelligent, well-travelled, very forward-thinking, much loved by the people, ruled for 63 years. And what's fascinating is that monarchy is based on blood, but this can prove that someone who doesn't have the blood is better than someone who does.
As Maharaja, Sayajirao Rao made many educational and social reforms and founded the Bank of Baroda, which is now one of the biggest banks in India. He was just 17 years old when he decided to build the palace in 1878, but tragedy struck soon after.
His first wife's name was Lakshmi Bai, and she passed away pretty young, leaving a son and 2 daughters. Sayajirao was pretty distraught when that happened, and she was not there when this palace was completed. He obviously, as remembrance for her, he named this as Lakshmi Vilas.
At the rear of Lakshmi Vilas Palace in Gujarat, India, is a very special room that is important to all the Gaikwad Maharajas.
This is the Ghadi Hall, and it's called the Ghadi Hall because this is the Ghadi. Now this Ghadi is very sacred to us. That's the reason when we walk in, we remove our shoes and come in here, is for this very reason. So every time somebody is coronated as a king, sits on this Ghadi, and he's coronated on this Ghadi. And this, of course, is older than the palace because this has come down from dynasties. So all the members who were coronated as kings have been coronated on this very Ghadi.
The Ghadi literally translates into the throne. So this is the most important symbol of power and authority and the supremacy that Baroda had over other principalities.
After Sayajirao Rao's death in February 1939, he was succeeded by his grandson, Maharaja Pratap Singh Rao, Samajit Singh's grandfather.
This is my grandfather's coronation in 1939. This is when Sayajirao Rao passed away, and Sayajirao Rao was his grandfather. Now his father passed away young, so he was not alive when Sayajirao Rao passed away and my grandfather was coronated. And he was brought up by Sayajirao Rao. He must have been, I think, about 30 when he was coronated.
Almost 50 years later, in 1988, Samajit Singh's father, Rajit Singh, became Maharaja, taking over from his older brother, Fateh Singh Rao.
My father was a trained artist. He loved his art. He painted a lot. There are a lot of paintings. There are just some paintings which have been selected by my mother. They're all paintings depicting different gods. And there's some paintings of the palace. But there are a whole lot of collection upstairs. There are a whole lot of mediums that he's tried with. There are paintings which he's done of my wife Radhika. There's one in our room. There's one which he's made of my sister. There's one which he's made of my mother.
After the death of his father in 2012, it was Samajit Singh's turn to sit on the sacred Ghadi.
It's emotional. Obviously, I missed my dad who had passed away a few months earlier, and the whole attention was on me on that particular day. So it's funny because everybody then starts calling you the Maharaja. But looking back, an important milestone in my life in that sense. And for this Ghadi and for the tradition of the house. So it was important that the ceremony of this nature did take place.
As well as housing the Maharajas of Baroda, Lakshmi Vilas Palace has had many famous visitors during its 130-year history.
In 1921, we had Prince of Wales, who then went on to become King Edward before he abdicated. He had visited Baroda, and it is said that he was so impressed by the tennis courts, which we still have. They are clay courts, that he squeezed in a game of tennis. I believe he played 4 sets, and he got late returning. So he just dashed up in his tennis gear to meet with Maharani, Rani Jimnabai II.
Another famous face who spent a lot of time at Lakshmi Villas in the late 19th century is Raja Ravi Varma, one of India's most revered painters.
He gave humane faces and forms to mythological figures, which up till now had been really exaggerated. Gods and goddesses would be made purple and blue with very, very, larger than life eyes or, fangs. He just made them more humane and relatable.
Varma loved Lakshmi Vilas so much that he ended up visiting Maharaja Sayajirao Rao for over a decade.
And he came for the first time to Baroda for the coronation of Sayajirao Maharaj. And it was the start of a lifelong friendship. And he was in Baroda on and off for 14 years. There was a studio built for him. He started making oleographs and prints. And then art really became accessible in India for the first time to the masses. Because there was a lot of discrimination that happened. A lot of people were not allowed inside temples. When these pictures came out, when oleographs started being printed by Raja Rai Varma in his own press, they were able to at least purchase a print and put them up in their home and pray to them. So he was a revolutionary artist.
Another art form celebrated at Lakshmi Vilas is the art of combat. The palace armory contains weaponry used in battle and for ceremonial purposes by the Gaikwads throughout the centuries.
There are all the different types of swords used for different purposes, and
We have the Wagnak here, which was famously worn by Shivaji Maharaj.
Shivaji Maharaj was a 17th century Indian warrior who defeated his great enemy, General Afzal Khan, in 1659.
And it was a big victory against him. And he was invited to his tent, and there was an attempt to throttle him.
So Afzal Khan went to sort of hug him this way and pulled out his dagger to hit him in the back. That's when Shivaji realized and just tore open, got in and tore open with these.
So Wagnak literally translates into lion's nails. That's what it means in Hindi.
Despite the armory, the palace itself was never built as a defensive structure. It has always been a family home. Lakshmi Vilas is split into 3 distinct parts. To the left is the Durbar Hall. The Maharaja's residence, where the family live today, is in the center, and the Zanana, the former women's apartments, are on the right-hand side of the west-facing building. Spread across the 500-foot wide structure are 15 domes crowning the palace.
One of the features of Indo-Saracenic architecture is the plethora of domes that covers the building. Some of these influenced by Hindu architecture, but mostly by Mughal architecture. But the challenge for the architects was, of course, what to construct the domes out of, and what to use them for, as the dome spaces weren't necessarily terribly functional. Some of them are empty and are just there for decoration. The large dome in the middle, though, provided a useful space for a huge water tank.
The 75,000-litre tank hidden within the dome is still in use today, providing the palace and its magnificent fountains with water.
Yeah, right now we are beneath the central dome, the biggest dome in the palace. Now if you see, it's a square room. So a dome on a square room needs few elements to transfer the load from dome to the walls and to the foundation. So there are squinches and pediments also. The squinches are the area where the dome is placed on a square or a rectangular room, and the corners which are left have been closed by squinches. Arch of the dome is transferred on the squinches and then onto a pediments. Pediments are these 4 corners which are conical in shape. So they transfer the even load of dome onto the walls, and walls transfer to the walls beneath and to the foundation.
Water is actually very deceptively heavy, and so when they were designing these domes, they would have really had to think about how much weight was going to be added, not just from the actual materials of the dome itself, but from these tanks that would sometimes be full of water and then sometimes be a bit empty. So they would have had variable loads to deal with in the design of those domes.
Domes have been around for thousands of years and serve both an aesthetic and a structural purpose.
So the way they work structurally is those are obviously 3D shapes. So if I just take you back into 2 dimensions for a second, back to the arches work in a very different way than beams do, because when you push down on an arch, what happens is that all the material within that arch is actually in compression, so it's being squashed. And domes work in a very similar way to the arches, except if you imagine spinning that 2D arch all the way around in 3 dimensions, that's when you get a dome. So again, when you push down on a dome, it's all being squashed and it's kind of channeling the forces down into the structure.
The water tank inside the central dome is fed via an electrical pump system by a 15th century underground reservoir. Believed to be built when the Islamic Mughal Empire ruled the area, the Stepwell pre-existed the palace. The lattice of decorative stonework surrounding the well stops it from caving in.
These particular ornate beams are acting as a structural member to support the side walls of the stepwell. The stepwell has been almost 70 to 80 feet below, and these walls have been casted from 80 feet below the ground level to withstand the pressure. And if you see, there are some domes also across there. So this domes may be having the center portion has been used as an oculus. Now oculus is a phenomenon wherein there is a gap, circular gap in domes, wherein you get blessings of the god basically. So they might have thought that this oculus might bless the water in the well.
Despite the phenomenal technology surrounding Lakshmi Vilas, it is still, first and foremost, a family home for the Maharaja Samajit Singh.
Of course, before I move in, I must tell you that my ancestors forgot to build a door here, and we still struggle with security and pigeons and what else, a whole lot of issues. But we've let it be. At some point, we will build a door. This is a job that's been left for us.
There's no door from here right up to our room, all the way on the first floor. There are no doors. Open to all. It's absolutely lovely living in a palace. You get used to the space, you get used to the privacy. Sometimes it's a little frustrating because you want to introduce an element which you like very much, or you've traveled around the world and you've picked up something and you carry it all the way back home and you want to put it on a shelf, and it just doesn't go with the house because the house has such a strong personality that anything you put in there just sticks out like a sore thumb.
The Maharaja and the Maharani were married in Delhi in February 2002. Radhika Raje can still remember the first time they met.
I was working as a journalist with the leading daily in Delhi, and it was an arranged match. Tried to keep it as casual, though of course such meetings can never be entirely casual because we all know why we need to meet. It was nice because I offered to pay and he let me. So I like that because, being a working girl myself, it was important for me to be with someone who understands and appreciates that. It was nice.
After the wedding, Maharani Radhika Raje arrived at Lakshmi Vilas for the very first time.
This is actually one of my most sentimental and favorite areas of the palace because this was my first introduction to my home. I came in here, I was under a heavy veil, of course, and I was very, very shy. And I came in here and all I saw was this profusion of color and sounds and smells because we had family and friends all around here and they were showering us with flower petals, with rose petals. It's overwhelming, and even today the magnificence is such that it's to behold for me, or even today. There are details that I would still see and notice and marvel at. That's the magic of this palace.
There used to be a private zoo on the grounds of Lakshmi Vilas Palace, which has since been swallowed up by part of an 18-hole golf course. Although it has long been closed, Maharaja Samajit Singh Gaikwad remembers visiting the animals as a child.
There was a giraffe, there was a zebra, there were crocodiles. There was a bear that used to sometimes come out. She was a friendly bear, and I think she used to walk across to the palace at times. We as kids, of course, found it fascinating, and we used to, of course, go there every day. For us, I mean, this was just wonderland as growing up as kids.
The day-to-day running of the palace has changed a lot since the 1970s, when Maharaja Samajit Singh was a child.
So the palace was never empty. The palace was always busy, and it had a lot of people in it. For instance, I recall while growing up, there were at least 16 chefs in our kitchen at that point doing different things. And there used to be an Indian kitchen, and there used to be a continental kitchen. So that's the scale of services that were packed into this palace. For us, coming here in the evening was dinner entertainment, because there used to be one person who used to dance out here for us in the evening. There used to be others who used to tell us stories. There would be a third one who would play pranks with the rest of us. I recall there used to be at least 7, 8 table boys coming in lovely white uniforms and serving us, but each one of them a character. And these are the people who brought so much of life and character to this palace.
Today, the Maharaja's house staff have shrunk from scores to just one. Although many people have come and gone, the dinner plates have remained the same.
We've been eating in these thalis ever since I've been growing up, and these are pretty heavy. These are Indian thalis of completely silver. We've just got spoiled eating in these. We come here every day, and of course it's one of the most important rooms because we get a lovely, delicious food here every day.
Lakshmi Vilas was built in 1890, and Samajit Singh appreciates the history of his palatial home.
It's interesting because this now for 130 years, family has lived in this house. Unlike many other palaces which after 50, 60, 70 years have become hotels or other things. But this palace, I think, I'm sure if you brought back all my aunts, sisters back to life, they all will have a story about this palace.
I think it's just incredibly a privilege to be living here and to be surrounded by this beauty and this nature. And you have the privilege of calling it home. And yet you must see that the legacy carries on, that you're able to maintain and keep this property the way it deserves to carry the story forward. That is a responsibility one feels as a resident of this house.
After growing up here, the Maharaja wants his 2 daughters, Princesses Nari Aniraje and Padmajaraje, to enjoy the vast space in the palace too.
There were scooties around and cycles around to go into verandas. We used to get them on the first floor. We used to get them on the second floor. It was great for a kid. So I sometimes tell my daughters, I said, the television is spoiling you, you know. The television makes you sit inside and you're watching this. I said, we had no television, so there was no way you could sit anywhere, and you had to be out all over. Growing up, I mean, this was one hell of a place.
And the princesses are proof that the apple doesn't fall too far from the tree.
The house is really spacious and we play with the dogs. We also like watch TV and we play a lot of games and do sports here.
For them, it gives them a great sense of identity, and they have a great sense of pride in their family and their home. And they are naturally already exposed to this level of art and culture and history by just living in this monument, which is amazing. Also the space. They love the sense of space, you know, the ceilings, the corridors, the expanse. They don't want to go on a holiday anywhere. They just want to be here with their scooties, with their dogs, and it's the perfect place for them.
I couldn't imagine living anywhere else than here. Me too.
Not many families experience living in such palatial surroundings, and the Maharani Radhika Raje is still blown away by the intricate design touches around her home.
It's like a canvas and the artist has been given a free hand. It's literally like there has been no budget allotted, there has been no kind of direction given other than just make it beautiful, you know, give it your best, put all your artistic creativity to it. I think that's the feeling I get when I see it, because it's so ornate and so beautiful, and each side element is different. So it's really been a creative aspect where everything, you know, it's been something they've tried out. It's been a learning experience for them. They've experimented, they've explored, and I think that's what comes across when you see the palace.
And as well as being dazzling to look at, the design of Lakshmi Vilas is practical too.
If you look at the steps that we have, you know, the height of the steps is just perfect. So even my mother-in-law, 74, she has no problems climbing the stairs because they're planned so beautifully. You know, the edges of the stairway, my daughters have never bumped into anything because they're all rounded. So, you know, there was so much attention to detail in those days that things were made to last, were made, you know, with a lot of love and attention.
There are even 4 courtyards within the walls of the palace, so the family can enjoy some fresh air without venturing out into the outer grounds.
So a feature of this palace is courtyards. So this is one of the 4 courtyards. The others have palm trees. So this one has the fountain. And the courtyards are meant to keep all the verandas cool in summers. We've noticed in summer that this does make a lot of difference, because when there's breeze flowing right through from one side to the other, the corridors get very cool. And the sound of water is so soothing.
I like the courtyard. It's got like fountains coming out of water, and it reaches all the way to this height. So when we look down from the terrace, then you can see the water coming up to you.
Lakshmi Vilas Palace and the Gaikwad family remain extremely important to the people of Vadodara. The palace and the dynasty are a symbol of a proud past and a bright future.
There was a time when the palace was known by the family. Now the family is known by the palace. You know, times have changed. You know, all over the world there are palaces. You have palaces even in Russia, but you don't have the Tsar anymore, you know. Or in China, but you don't have the emperor anymore. So, you know, when you do have a family and a palace and the two are still entwined, I think it's important to keep them together.
An impossible mix of high-tech engineering and stunning culturally fused architecture, Lakshmi Vilas still stands as proudly today as it did in 1890.
Here we are, after several knocks and earthquakes.
And about 130 years later.
Well, I think this structure has seen a lot of other buildings topple under its own weight. So that says a lot about the engineering and quality of the time. It's taken me 17 years and I'm still discovering more aspects and more beauty. And my daughters now have a better eyesight than me, and they're all, look at that, Mama, look at that curvature, and look at that peacock there. And there is so much to be still discovered because it's so beautifully intertwined.